Welcome back to the deep dive. You know how this works. You hit us up with what you are reading, and we break it all down for you. So today we are diving into a topic that I know a ton of you are interested in, building muscle, right? And not just building muscle, but building muscle fast and efficiently. And to do that, we are going to be looking at The Secrets to Gaining Muscle Mass Fast by A. Ellis, which is kind of cool. It's actually in a 3-ring binder.
Yeah, I mean, that's the first thing that jumped out at me, just looking at the materials. It's meant to be very hands-on, this binder. He even says in there to, take notes and stuff. It's like a very personalized approach, not your typical textbook.
No, it's not. And,
Yeah.
Ellis, he starts off by, establishing his credibility. And he calls himself, a skinny guy before, he was able to bulk up to 180 pounds using these exact same principles.
Right.
And, it's not just theory for him. This is what he used.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool.
Yeah, yeah.
So what we want to do today is really boil down those core principles, right?
Sure.
The actionable strategies that you can use to gain muscle,
Yeah.
give you the real, concise points for how to do this right.
Okay, so getting into it, one of the first things he talks about, or like the cornerstone, really, of his approach, is the synergy of training, diet, and supplements. Like that all three of these things need to be working together.
Right.
And, he makes the argument that that's where people fall short, is they might be training really hard, but then, their diet's not there, or vice versa.
Yeah, he's big on that.
Yeah.
He talks about, his 12-week journey and, how when he actually combined, the training, the diet, the supplementation, that's when he saw the huge changes.
Right.
So kind of cool to see that. It's not just one thing you can focus on, it's the combination.
Right. So yeah, then getting into the specifics, he gets into the weight training fundamentals. So he's got some sections on, the terms and then, some of the exercises. But for you, I think it's important to understand, compound versus isolation exercises.
Yeah, let's break that down.
Yeah. So compound exercises are the big multi-joint movements. So you're talking squats, deadlifts, bench press, stuff like that. And, he really hammers home that those should be, the main focus for overall mass gain because they hit so many large muscle groups at the same time.
Right.
Versus the isolation exercises, which, are like single muscle groups, like, you're doing bicep curls.
Right.
Something like that. And, it's interesting because he has certain compound exercises that he kind of flags as very important. He puts those in all caps. So those are your squats, your deadlifts, and pullovers.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And he goes into metabolism too, right? Like how efficiently your body is burning calories.
Yeah, and he lists a ton of different factors that increase it and decrease it.
Right. What are some of those?
Well, eating more frequently, moderate cardio, not overdoing it, having more muscle mass because, that burns more at rest.
Right.
And then protein, eating enough protein. And then on the opposite side, what can kind of slow you down is eating infrequently, having a higher body fat percentage, inactivity, low calorie dieting for long periods of time.
Right.
And even the intense endurance activities.
And he gets into form too, right?
Oh.
Especially for those very important exercises.
That huge. Yeah.
Like the squats and the deadlifts.
Yeah, and he really gets into the safety aspect of those as well and really describes, the technique.
Right.
Making sure your chest is up, slight arch in the lower back. Don't round your shoulders. Don't look down, so it's very specific about, protecting your spine and everything. And, he recommends even using a range of accessories. So he's got things like a skin caliper, tape measure to track your progress, a blender and food scale, for actually making sure you're hitting your nutrition, and even weight training belts and lifting straps for when you're, doing those heavy lifts. So it's pretty comprehensive.
Right. All right. So let's jump into his mass training principles. What are the principles that he really drives home?
So the first thing is he says to use heavy weights.
Okay.
In a low rep range. So 4 to 7 reps.
Okay.
And his reasoning is, that puts the muscles under a lot of mechanical tension, which is one of the main drivers of hypertrophy.
Okay.
And that's often different from what you see a lot of people doing at the gym.
Right. Where they're just pumping out, 15, 20 reps with lightweight.
Exactly.
Right.
And then another interesting thing is he talks about training to failure.
Right.
And how he doesn't necessarily, believe that you have to train to failure every single set. But he thinks consistently, challenging your muscles with something out of the ordinary, that kind of stress is really key. But he's a little bit more, practical in that, maybe you save training to failure for the last set of an exercise, or if you're done something like supersets,
Right.
especially, if you're training by yourself and you need a spot or something like that.
And then hitting a plateau, right? I feel like that's a pretty common experience for people who, are lifting consistently.
Yeah. And, he explains that the body is incredibly adaptable.
Right.
So if you keep doing the same stresses over and over, you're going to stop responding.
Right.
So that's where, he really stresses changing your workout parameters,
Yeah.
so like changing the exercises, changing the tempo of your reps, maybe add a pause at the bottom of the squat, really emphasize the lowering of the weight. He's got different things like that, different set and rep schemes. Maybe, trying a high volume approach with like 10 sets of 10.
Right.
Or pyramid sets where you go, 30, 20, 10, something like that. So really just, keeping your body guessing.
Yeah. Okay. And avoiding overtraining.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, especially when they're first starting, they think more is better.
Yeah. He's got a whole section on that, and he gives you, like, the telltale signs. If you're getting sick a lot, if you're just not really feeling like working out.
Right.
If you have a lot of muscle spasms, if you're losing weight for no reason, if your strength gains have stalled, and if you have any recurring injuries. And his advice is pretty clear. Stick to a maximum of 3 exercises per body part. That way you're managing your training volume.
Right.
And he also addresses soreness.
Right.
Because a lot of people, especially when they're new to lifting, they think, oh, I'm sore. That must mean it's working.
Right.
And he explains that, soreness is really an indication that your muscles are still in the recovery process.
Right.
And, if you train when you're really sore, you're actually risking more muscle breakdown.
Right.
You haven't really let them repair.
Right.
And he even says, personally, he takes like 3 to 5 days to recover.
Wow.
Yeah. So it can vary,
Okay, interesting. And then he gets into leg training.
Right. Huge. Yeah. Yeah, he's very emphatic about that.
Right. He's like, don't skip leg day.
Do not skip leg day. He says your legs have the largest muscle groups in your whole body.
Right.
And they're essential for overall mass development, for really putting stress on your skeletal system, which can help you grow in other areas as well.
Right.
And, plus, if you don't train your legs, you're going to end up looking really unbalanced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chicken legs.
Yeah.
Nobody wants that.
No. So he's very, very clear on, making sure you hit legs.
Okay. And tying that into workout frequency and, rest.
Yeah. So based on all of that, he recommends training each body part only once per week and really prioritizing rest on your non-training days to allow for that muscle repair and growth to happen.
Right.
And he even suggests, little 30-minute naps as a way to enhance recovery.
Wow, I like that.
Yeah, why not? Right.
Right.
And then, he has this concept of cycling your workouts.
Okay.
And he says that, for beginners, you might see, consistent progress for maybe 6 to 8 weeks.
Right.
Before you really need to change anything.
Right.
But then once you get more experience, you're going to adapt faster. Maybe every 3 to 4 weeks, you're going to have to swish things up.
Right.
Keep those muscles guessing.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So switching gears now.
Yeah.
What are his strategies for, the diet, for, really putting on the muscle mass?
So fundamental principle, unsurprisingly, is a caloric surplus.
Right.
So consistently eating more calories than you're burning.
Right.
But he's quick to point out, though, that, not all calories are created equal.
Right. You can't just eat a bag of chips and call it a day.
Exactly. Exactly. He really stresses prioritizing those nutrient-rich calories. So we're talking like lean proteins, whole grains, fruits, vegetables.
Okay.
Versus, your processed junk food.
Okay.
You might hit your calories, but you're not really giving your body the building blocks that it needs.
Right.
And then obviously protein intake is like a huge cornerstone of the diet,
Right.
For repairing that muscle tissue after training and building new muscle.
And what about fat? Because I know, back in the day, it was all about, low fat, this and that.
Yeah. He actually has a really interesting point about that. He explains that dietary fat is really important for testosterone production.
Right.
And that's a key hormone in muscle growth.
Okay.
And he even kind of debunks the myth that, dietary fat is what's making us fat.
Right.
He suggests that it's actually, overconsumption of simple carbs. That's often a bigger contributor.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Carbs, you need them.
Yeah. He explains they're basically fuel for the body,
Right.
especially during your intense workouts.
Okay.
And he differentiates between simple carbs, which are quickly digested, and then complex carbs, which, provide more of a sustained release of energy.
Right.
So, things like brown rice, oats, that kind of thing.
Okay, yeah.
And he recommends focusing on those complex carbs for consistent energy.
And meal frequency, he gets into that too, right? Like how often you're eating.
Yeah, he's got a pretty specific strategy here.
Okay.
He says you should eat 6 smaller meals throughout the day
Okay.
and space those out about every 3 hours.
Okay.
And his reasoning is that, that way you're constantly providing your body with nutrients
Right. Right.
and optimizing nutrient absorption.
Okay.
And he, specifically says why this is so important for, people who are naturally lean or what he calls, skinny guys, is because if they go longer than 3 hours without eating, they can actually start breaking down muscle tissue.
Oh.
Yeah, for energy. So it's like that consistent fueling that's really important for them.
I was going to say, we hear so much about, intermittent fasting these days.
Yeah.
Like how does his approach compare to that?
That's a great question. I think with Ellis's approach, it's really about like constantly having those amino acids available to, potentially maximize muscle protein synthesis throughout the day.
Okay.
Whereas intermittent fasting, it's about, those specific eating windows,
Right.
which, has its own benefits in terms of like insulin sensitivity and, overall calorie management. So I think, what's best really depends on the person,
Right.
their lifestyle, their preferences, how they tolerate each one.
Right.
And I think some of the research suggests that, just the total protein intake, and overall calorie balance
Right.
might be more important than specifically, how many meals you're eating.
Right.
But, I think his recommendation is really coming from, his experience and the idea of trying to prevent that breakdown.
Right.
Especially, for those skinny guys that maybe are a little bit more prone to that if they're going longer without eating.
Yeah. And hydration.
Yeah.
Obviously, super important.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
He stresses that a lot. Make sure you're drinking enough water. He even gives a formula. 0.66 times your body weight in pounds equals, the ounces that you should aim for each day.
Okay.
And he points out, it's so crucial for muscle function, transporting nutrients,
Yeah.
Vascularity, how visible your veins are.
Right.
And just helping your body eliminate those waste products,
Right.
especially when you're on a higher protein diet.
And then the overall like makeup of the diet, in terms of the macros, the protein, the carbs, the fats.
Yeah, he recommends a ratio of 40% of your calories from protein,
Okay.
30% from carbs,
Okay.
and 30% from fats. And that's specifically, for that muscle gain.
All right. So let's move on to supplements.
Okay.
So he makes it clear it's not like you have to take these.
Right.
Especially, if you've got your training dialed in, your diet's good.
Yeah, he says they're not mandatory.
Right.
But he does suggest that, certain supplements can be helpful.
Right.
For speeding up results, for convenience, so they're really there to supplement, not replace.
Right.
And he specifically highlights meal replacement powder.
Okay.
Or MRPs.
Right.
Especially, when you're aiming for those frequent meals.
Right.
Because they're convenient.
Right.
They have the right balance of protein, carbs, fats.
Right.
He even mentions Myoplex as, his go-to during his program.
And then creatine monohydrate.
Yep. Big on that one, too. He says that plays a key role in providing energy to your muscles, especially during those high-intensity activities. And, it's naturally found in foods like red meat. But he emphasizes that, it's safe. There's lots of research on it.
Okay.
And the benefits are, increasing lean body mass, improving strength, power, endurance.
Right.
Faster recovery between sets.
Okay.
And he even explains the whole cell volumizing effect.
Right.
And how it's not, bloating you up, but it's water retention within the muscle cells.
Right.
That kind of gives you that fuller look.
Right.
And he even talks about, doing a loading phase where you take more creatine initially.
Okay.
And then, a maintenance phase after that where you just take a smaller amount daily.
And then whey protein. That's pretty standard.
Yep. Definitely a staple.
Okay.
It's a really high quality, easily digestible protein source.
Right.
Convenient for, if you want to increase your protein intake.
Right.
Add it to meals, post-workout shake.
Right.
He even suggests, having it before bed with some essential fatty acids.
Okay.
To slow down the digestion, provide those amino acids overnight.
Okay.
And he mentioned precision protein as an example of a good one.
And essential fatty acids. He gets into that too, right?
Yeah, EFAs. And mostly for, overall health,
Right.
supporting hormone production, reducing inflammation. He
Yeah.
specifically recommends things like Udo's Choice or flaxseed oil as good sources.
Okay.
And then another one is L-glutamine.
Okay.
And this one's interesting because he says it can help with recovery.
All right.
Preventing muscle breakdown, that catabolism,
All right.
promoting cell volumization, strengthening the immune system,
Right.
which can be kind of suppressed by intense training,
Right.
decreasing recovery time. And he even says it plays a role in increasing growth hormone levels.
Wow.
Yeah. And then on top of that, it also helps with producing glutathione, which is a powerful antioxidant,
Okay.
to fight that exercise-induced stress.
And then pro-hormones. I feel like this is where, people need to tread lightly.
Yeah, and he's very clear about that. He's actually pretty cautious about them.
Okay.
He basically says, you can definitely make really good, consistent gains for at least the first year of training
Right.
without even touching them.
Right.
And he does mention there are some risks associated,
Right.
and he really advises against using them prematurely.
Right.
But if you're going to consider them, and it's after, a significant period of natural training, he mentions a few specific ones,
Okay.
like 4-androstenediol and 19-norandrostenediol as potentially less problematic options.
Okay.
And he specifically says to avoid androstenedione
Okay.
because it's got a higher potential to convert to estrogen. But overall, he's just very big on, proceed with caution, talk to a doctor,
Right.
especially if you have a family history of any kind of, hypertension or heart problems.
Oh,
So, yeah, that's one to really be careful with.
Right. And then he also talks about, the importance of vitamins and minerals.
Yeah, and I was kind of surprised by this because, he's big on getting a balanced diet,
Right.
but he still thinks that, supplementing with vitamins and minerals is like, a good insurance policy,
Okay.
because the quality of food, maybe we're not getting everything we need.
Right.
Plus, we're putting a lot of stress on the body.
Right. With all the exercise.
Yeah, exactly. And he specifically lists a multivitamin, one that doesn't have iron
Okay.
because, too much iron can be a problem.
Right.
And then vitamin C is really important,
Okay.
for being an antioxidant, helping with tissue repair, collagen synthesis.
Right. And he gives you a tip too, right, for buying all this stuff.
Yeah, he actually gives a really practical tip about, saving money.
Okay.
Because all this can get expensive.
Yeah.
He says that buying online is usually 30 to 40% cheaper
Okay.
than going to a brick and mortar store.
Right.
And, if you do want to shop in person, he recommends Vitamin Shop. Says they've got good potential for discounts, knowledgeable staff.
Right.
And then GNC is kind of like, last resort.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just a little helpful tip.
So bringing this all together, what are the takeaways, if you're looking at Ellis's book, what are the main things that you need to really grasp onto?
Well, I think fundamentally it's a comprehensive approach.
Right.
Prioritizing that heavy compound weight training,
Yeah.
fueling your body with, the right amount of calories from good sources, enough protein, healthy fats, those complex carbs,
Right.
and getting that rest, giving your muscles time to recover.
Right. Right.
And then, while supplements can help, they're not a substitute for that good foundation.
Right. They're supplemental.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And he's big on, listening to your body's signals,
Right.
especially when it comes to soreness.
Mm-hmm.
Don't push yourself too hard, don't overtrain, and, just being consistent and patient because his own 12-week transformation, it shows you what's possible.
Right. So we've done a deep dive into the secrets to gaining muscle mass fast,
Right.
and we've really pulled out, what Ellis is trying to get across.
Right.
And hopefully this has given you a really good understanding of, how to approach building muscle.
Right. And this is really meant to be practical,
Right.
giving you that solid framework.
Right.
And now we want you to think about, what really resonates with you. What are you going to do with this information?
Right.
What steps are you going to take?
Yeah.
And just to leave you with one final thought, given how much emphasis Ellis puts on, the training, the diet, and the supplements, which of those three do you think is, holding you back the most right now?
Yeah. Good question.
Yeah. And what's one specific change that you can make this week
Right.
to really address that?
Yeah. It's all about taking action. Right.
Right, exactly. Because, hopefully this has been a little bit of a shortcut
right?
to becoming well-informed. But,
Yeah.
if something sparked your interest, dive in deeper.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Until next time.